Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, I'm going to look at 5 more Seattle grunge bands that the mainstream critics don't seem to talk about. An important band in the development of the Seattle underground scene in the 1980s were the U-Men. Now, they played a mix of kind of noise rock, kind of a garage rock psychobilly thing, but they had like the post-punk and punk, and it just sounds very intense, it's very frantic, it's really kind of quite challenging, noisy music. Now, they were formed in 1980 by vocalist John Bigley, guitarist Tom Price, drummer Charlie Ryan, and bassist Robin Buchan. They're taking inspiration from the old Seattle garage rockers like the Sonics and the Wailers from the 1960s, but also from bands like the Cramps, the Birthday Party, and Pere Ubu. They kind of occupy a similar place in the American underground as bands like Scratch Acid or even the Butthole Surfers. Now, by the time they released their first EP in 1984, Jim Tillman had become the bassist. Now, what you've got here is you've got these kind of short bursts of weird, aggressive punk rock with a kind of swampy sound, a lot of guttural howls, especially on the song Gilda. They would then go on to release the Stop Spinning EP in 1985. Now, singer John Bigley's vocals, they're kind of described as this constant state of exaggeration. It's like howling, grunting, growling. It kind of defied the normal singing conventions of the time and added just to the band's weirdness and energy. They're just kind of this mix of art punk and swampy garage rock. They would appear on the famous Deep Six compilation out of Seattle in 1986. Jim Tillman would leave the band. They actually had Tom Hazelmeyer from Halo of Fries for one show, and then they got bassist Tony Ransom. They released their only full-length album, Step on a Bug, in 1988. Again, a great sound with kind of like blues skunk, avant-garde noise, garage rock brashness, and just greasy sounding. Really good stuff. Split up in 1989, Price would begin playing in the band Gas Huffer. The U-Men are not only a band that was a kind of precursor to what would emerge in the Seattle scene, but they're actually an example of just the great noisy experimental rock that was found throughout the underground music scenes across America. Now we're going to look at a grunge band that had a real neo-psychedelic and almost shoegaze kind of feel to them. And that band, of course, is Love Battery. They were formed in 1989 and were made up of Ron Nine on vocals, Kevin Whitworth on guitar, Tommy Simpson on bass, and then Dan Peters. They took their name from a song by the Buzzcocks. Now, the band developed a sound that merged really fuzzy, heavy psychedelic guitars with kind of like Beatlesque melodies, and that's all with that all-around like Pacific Northwest edge and thickness. Though they're not kind of like so much influenced by like the metal and the hardcore punk riffs that would be found in other bands. But singer Ron Nine, he can reach those Chris Cornell levels of high-pitched vocals at times. In fact, they have some of that kind of snottiness sometimes that you would find in Britpop. But everything is really caked in this great fuzzy guitar tone. They start with a single that later became an EP and then eventually became an LP. Between the Eyes, it was released as a single on Sub Pop in 1989. It's just got this incredibly delayed fuzzy guitar with a kind of dream pop with an edge vocal. The EP would come out in 1990 and then the LP would come out in 1991. And this album just sounds incredible. Again, it's like fuzz, wah-wah, and tough but ethereal vocals, great layers of textures. Really, this band deserves a lot more recognition. But then in 1992, they would release an absolute masterpiece, Dayglow. It has this melodic and kind of like textured sound, and it's almost like these trance-like rhythms at times, and this, but again, you got these overpowering, really, really fuzzy guitars. I remember the song Out of Focus. It made such an impression on me when I first heard it back in 1992. And this is when Seattle was all the rage. And maybe because their sound was different from their contemporaries, that the success never really came their way like it did with so many of the other bands. 1993's Far Gone. It's still quite a good album, but there is more of a kind of big rock in the production and less of that layered texture. 1995's Straight Freak Ticket. This definitely had a better sound, a really good strong songwriting, and it's got a cool kind of blues rock element. But again, you've got the fuzz and the psychedelia, and it was a major label album released on Atlas Records, but poor sales saw drummer Jason Finn focus on his other band, the President of the United States. They would be dropped by their label, and they're kind of in limbo for a few years. They finally released their final album, Confusion A Go-Go, in 1999. This album is pretty hard-rocking album. It drives forward. It gives an opportunity for Ron Nine to vent his frustrations about the music industry. The band would go on only playing occasional shows, though, and eventually they'd go on hiatus in 2005. They still do reunion shows. In fact, they did one show where they played Dayglow in its entirety. And that is the album that really shows the magic of the band's kind of fuzz-drenched psychedelic pop that has that hard edge. Yeah, Love Battery are a band that deserve a lot more recognition. And showed that the Seattle sound that was kind of called grunge, it was a lot more diverse, not so monolithic. Now, we need to talk about a man named Andrew Wood, who was in two really important bands. Now, unlike some of the bands that I've looked at in these two episodes who felt sort of this sense of punk rock integrity about selling out, Andrew Wood was different. He really wanted to be a rock star since he was young. When he was 14, him and his brother would form Malfunction. They stayed home during one Easter instead of going to grandma's house, and they recorded their first demo on cassette tape. Now, over the next few years, they became a serious band and, integrated themselves into the underground scene in Seattle. They had a love of both metal and punk and just a whole big 70s rock feel and that kind of 80s rock star sound. There's lots of big guitar solos, and Andrew Wood would give these real theatrical performances. He's taking cues from Mark Bolan, from Freddie Mercury, and even Gene Simmons. Now, when performing live, Andrew took on this persona. He called it Landrew, the love child, while his brother Kevin was Kevin Stein, and drummer Reagan became Thunder. Andrew would actually wear makeup and sang. He played this kind of like wireless bass, which allowed him to go into the crowd and interact with people. In some concerts, he would actually just start eating a bowl of cereal, and then he would throw the bowl into the audience. Malfunction, they also contributed songs to that Deep Six compilation. And the song Yo Heart, Not Your Hands, it kind of sounds like Black Sabbath meets glam rock in a muffled garage. Stars in You, it kind of has this punky grunge sounds. Band, they didn't really get a lot of promotion by Sub Pop, who they were signed with at the time. And, after Green River dissolved, we talked about them in the last episode, Wood actually began to play with Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament. Now, if you remember from the last episode, Gossard and Ament wanted to do something more mainstream, and hey, now here was their chance. Wood had once stated he'd be cool with opening for a band like Warrant, and they would be soon joined by Bruce Fairweather and Greg Gilmore, and the band Mother Love Bone was formed. When you wonder why there's this more mainstream rock version of the grunge sound, a la bands like Pearl Jam, it really comes from this band. But you know what? Don't be dismissive. This band is so much more than that. Yes, they were in a certain sense a kind of hair metal adjacent band, but they took that sound and fused it with kind of like epic emotional songwriting, and they still have the edge of the city's like distorted sound. And they were actually eventually picked up by Polydor, and in March 1989 they released the EP Shine. It's a very transitional work. Like, it's coming from that hair metal scene, but it's a foreshadowing of what's to come. There's just some great songs on this album. There's Through Fade Away, it's just an energetic song, and then you've got another great rockin' song, which is Mindshaker Meltdown. But for me, I really like Chloe Dancer, Crown of Thorns. It's like this epic 8-minute song that builds up. It starts with this very somber piano-driven ballad. It's really cool. I absolutely love this sound here. And again, this is where 80s glam meets what will become alternative rock in the 90s. It's very transitional. And, they actually fit in nicely with some of the great hard rock bands of the late 80s. I'm thinking of things like The Cult. Now, they would go on to release their full-length album in 1990. Now, this is an absolute hard rock masterpiece. Critics hailed the album as one of the, great albums of the 90s. And, you get dynamics of bands like Led Zeppelin in their sound, but they got a unique kind of 90s twist on it. It's kind of occupying the same space as something like Guns N' Roses, but there's more soul, more melancholy. It's kind of just more alternative. And you've got these great, again, rockers like Shangri-La and Holy Roller, but for me, it's the atmospheric, kind of more ballad, mid-paced songs like Bone China, Stargazer, and of course the incredible Man of Golden Words.
Bone China, my friends. Seems I've been living in the temple of the dog.
Wood is a performer who really wore his heart on his sleeve. He, unfortunately, battled on and off heroin addiction for years. And the tragedy is just as before this album was supposed to be released, he shot too much heroin and he died. Andrew Wood had so much talent and he was arguably on the verge of really making it big time. Now, a tribute album and band called Temple of the Dog, that was a line from Mother Love Bone's song, was put together, and the group included Gossard and Ament, but also Chris Cornell and Matt Cameron of Soundgarden, and a singer called Eddie Vedder. Now, out of the ashes of Mother Love Bone, Pearl Jam was formed, and of course they would become unbelievably successful. Now, Andrew Wood's story is an incredible tragedy. And even though Mother Love Bone was not punk rock, they were a fantastic musical group. And again, we're a transition from the hair metal era to the alternative rock era. And it's got really good songwriting. But if you want to talk about grunge and how it describes a certain sound, there is no band that is the physical manifestation of the concept, the sound, and the look of the genre. And that band, of course, is Tad. Tad are just fierce. Formed in 1988 by Thomas Andrew Doyle. He recorded a 3-song demo, which he played all the instruments, and then he'd soon be joined by bassist Kurt Danielson, drummer Steve Weed, and a second guitarist, Gary Thornson. Tad, as he now called himself, but it was actually also the name of the band, he sang and played guitar as well. Now, Doyle, Tad, being 300 pounds and dressing like a lumberjack, was quite an imposing figure on the stage. And the music took like metal riffs and it put them through a garage rock sound and kind of like an early 70s distortion pedal. And you got this influence also of like underground noise bands like Big Black, Killdozer, and Sonic Youth in there as well. And again, it's kind of like the manifestation of Doyle's physical appearance in the music. And that's what was heard on their 1989 debut album, God's Balls. It opens with the crushing Behemoth, a great noisy sound there. So many great tracks like Heliod, Boiler Room, Satan's Chainsaw, Nipple Belt. Tad's gruff vocals and the heavy guitar put the band into this kind of like sludgy metal category. But again, there's also that kind of 80s weird noise thing happening as well. It's just fantastic stuff.
They came on down for no reason, just for blood, lost for blood.
And in fact, their EP Salt Lick was produced by Steve Albini, and that came out in 1990. That opens with a great noisy track, Axe to the Grind. You've got High on the Hog, it brings that Sabbath heaviness, and then you got the weird, noisy, yet intense Wood Goblin. It's another highlight. That song is a cool video where at the beginning, Doyle shows off his chainsaw skills in the Pacific Northwest forest. Then they would go on tour with a band named Nirvana in Europe. This was before Nirvana really broke. And then they would record their masterpiece in 1991, 8-Way Santa. It was released on Sub Pop in February of that year. Oh man, what a great album. I remember buying this as a kid. It opens with the bulldozer sounding Jinx. You got these great songs like Wired God and Delinquent, where actually Tad is using a bit more melodic elements in his songwriting. Cool song called Jack Pepsi, and it's based on a story about Tad and his friends drinking a bunch of Pepsi and Jack Daniels before deciding to drive on a frozen lake only to have the ice break. Yeah. And then the song Stumbling Man, that had a video just showcasing various street alcoholics. Now, the cover for the album was controversial. I remember buying the cassette tape at the time. The band had used a photo from a photo album that they had bought secondhand, and they found this photo of a hippie-looking couple kind of touching in an inappropriate way, and they said, hey, let's use that as an album cover. Now, the woman in the picture had become a conservative Christian later in life, and she kind of threatened to sue, so the cover was changed, and that wasn't the only problem. When they released the single for Jack Pepsi, they actually used the Pepsi logo, so of course the corporation took legal action and they had to change it. But this album just has a great crushing, heavy, noisy sound with a greater sense of melody. Now, as the sort of grunge wave happened in 91 and 92, they ended up getting signed to Warner, and they released Inhaler in 1993. It was a solid album, and even though they opened for Soundgarden on the Super Unknown tour, they failed to make a huge breakthrough. And, they had problems with that label, but then they ended up getting signed to Elektra. And they released the Infrared Riding Hood in 1995. But, after a month of releasing the album, their A&R rep got fired, and soon the band got dropped. And you know what? Throughout, there had been numerous lineup changes, and there's substance abuse issues, and the band basically dissolved in 1998. Now, for me, Tad are the quintessential grunge band. Heavy, intense, noisy, just a great, thick vibe. Now, it's a real shame that so many bands from the Seattle music scene of the 80s and early 90s are not well known or recognized today. This city produced a vibrant music scene that was just a part of the great tapestry of sounds that were, made up the American underground of the 1980s. What was defined as grunge in so many ways encapsulated all the different aspects of rock music that I like. The bands were taking influences from hardcore punk, 60s garage rock, British post-punk, the underground noise scenes in the United States, the fierce proto-punk of Detroit, along with the thick, heavy riffs of 70s hard rock and metal. These are all my favorite genres, and the various bands that made up the Seattle scene would all have, varying elements of all these styles of music. And while Nirvana's breakthrough in 1991 was great because it put a spotlight on all these sounds that were coming out of the city, it would ultimately lead to the demise of the genre as grunge became commercialized and just reduced to a trend and a novelty. And ultimately, people lost interest in a few years, and the sound became associated with the numerous imitators. You know what? Please check out all these bands I've looked at over the past 2 episodes. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Which Seattle bands do you think deserve more recognition? And I know I missed a few on this episode. Thank you.